Chapter 1. The Velvet Noose. I stood in the center of the polished mahogany floor, my lungs burning against the stays of my silk corset. Stanton, Alpha of the North Ridge, dressed in a midnight blue tailcoat, didn't look at me. He looked at the crowd. I, Alpha Stanton, formally reject Beatrice as my mate, he announced, his voice a low, cultured rumble. A queen must bring status to the throne. Beatrice brings only commonality. The room erupted in a flurry of lace fans and cruel whispers. Stanton expected me to shatter, to drop to my knees in front of the finest pedigrees in the territory. Instead, I felt a strange, cold clarity. The bond didn't feel like a broken heart. It felt like a leash finally snapping. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I adjusted my lace gloves with agonizing slowness, the heat of my anger far more intoxicating than the phantom ache in my chest. "Commonality, Stanton?" I said, my voice cutting through the murmurs like a razor through silk. I could smell the sweat on the back of his neck from 5 paces away, the primal scent of his sudden, flickering doubt. "You've spent so much time polishing your image that you've forgotten what a real wolf smells like. You aren't rejecting me because I'm not enough. You're rejecting me because you're terrified that if you kept me, the pack would finally realize who really holds the power in this partnership." Stanton stiffened, his knuckles whitening against the arm of Lady Genevieve, his chosen replacement. The etiquette of our world was a thin veneer over raw, predatory instinct. By speaking back, I wasn't just being difficult, I was committing social suicide. The Alpha's scent turned acidic, agitation masked by expensive lavender cologne. "Leave, Beatrice," he hissed, his eyes darkening, "before I forget my manners and treat you like the stray you've become." "Oh, don't worry about your manners, Stanton. They were always as fake as your claim to this territory," I replied, a dry, reckless laugh bubbling up in my throat. I turned my back on him, a move that should have been impossible for a rejected female, and began to walk towards the massive oak doors. The heat in the room shifted. It didn't just rise, it deepened, becoming heavy and humid, smelling of ancient cedar and the ozone that precedes a devastating storm. The aristocrats at the edge of the ballroom scrambled backward, their heels clicking frantically on the wood. A man stood in the shadows of the foyer, leaning against the gold-leafed doorframe. He wore no cravat, his white shirt open at the throat to reveal skin that seemed to radiate a rhythmic, thrumming heat. This wasn't a wolf of the ballroom. This was something older. The Lycan King, Caspian, watched me with the terrifying focus of a predator who had just found something worth hunting. He didn't move, but the air around him was so thick with pheromones it felt like walking into a wall. Stanton let out a warning growl, a pathetic sound compared to the silence of the man in the doorway. Caspian stepped into the light, his presence stripping the room of its refined pretenses. He ignored Stanton entirely, his gaze locked in the pulse jumping in my neck. He tilted his head, a slow, predatory smirk pulling at his lips. "You walk quite well for a woman who was just told she is nothing," he said, his voice a deep, gravelly vibration that made my skin prickle with a terrifying new heat. He held out a hand, not in an invitation, but in a challenge. "Tell me, Beatrice, are you truly finished with the small-minded, or are you just looking for a bigger cage?" Chapter 2. The King's Carriage. The silence in the ballroom was so thick, I could hear the frantic heartbeat of the girl Stanton had chosen to replace me. Caspian didn't move, but his hand remained extended, a bridge over a social abyss. To take it was to declare war on the North Ridge. To refuse it was to crawl back to the servants' quarters in shame. I looked at his palm. calloused and radiating a heat that made the gaslit air shimmer. Then I looked at Stanton. My former alpha's face was a mask of aristocratic fury, his scent turning sharp and bitter, like burnt copper. "She isn't going anywhere with you, Vane," Stanton growled, stepping forward. The crowd gasped, a collective rustle of silk and wool. "The rejection is fresh. By law, she remains under my protection until the moon sets." "Protection?" I asked, finally finding my voice. It didn't tremble. If anything, it sounded like the snap of a cold winter branch. I turned my eyes back to the Lycan King, whose smirk had widened into something truly dangerous. "You threw me to the wolves, Stanton. It's a bit late to worry about the predators I choose to dance with." I reached out and placed my gloved hand in Caspian's. The contact was electric, not a spark of magic, but a physical jolt of pure biological compatibility. His fingers closed over mine, firm and grounding, pulling me toward him. The room seemed to tilt as he led me out of the ballroom, the crowd parting like the Red Sea. We didn't run. We walked with the slow, deliberate pace of those who owned the floor beneath them. Outside, the night air was crisp, smelling of coal smoke and damp cobblestones. A black brougham carriage waited, the horses large, midnight-colored beasts that shifted restlessly, their eyes wide and wild. They didn't smell like stable animals, they smelled like the forest. Caspian handed me inside, the velvet interior of the carriage smelling of cedar and aged brandy. As the door clicked shut, the world of etiquette and lace fans vanished. The space was small, intimate, and charged with the weight of the man sitting opposite me. Caspian leaned back, the shadows of the passing gaslights playing over the hard angles of his face. He didn't speak for a long moment, simply watching me with those heavy, unblinking eyes. "You have a very sharp tongue, Beatrice," he said, his voice dropping into a register that made the velvet seat beneath me vibrate. "Most Omegas would be halfway to a convent by now, weeping for their lost destiny. You, however, seem more concerned with the quality of my cravat." "I never cared much for destiny," I replied, leaning back and matching his gaze. "And for the record, your cravat is missing. It makes you look like a brigand." A low, rumbling sound came from his chest, a laugh that was more of a growl. "I am a brigand, and you are a woman who just insulted the most powerful alpha in the territory before climbing into the carriage of a man the church calls a monster." He leaned forward, the heat coming off him nearly overwhelming in the confined space. "Tell me, did you choose me to spite him, or because you realized Stanton was a child playing at being a king?" "I chose the door," I said firmly. "You just happened to be standing in it." He moved then, a blur of predatory speed, his hand pinning the wall of the carriage beside my head. He didn't touch me, but I could feel the thrum of his pulse. "The gray zone is a long drive, Beatrice. By the time we reach my gates, Stanton will have realized what he lost. He will hunt you, not out of love, but out of a man's wretched pride." The carriage suddenly lurched to a violent halt. Outside, the sound of snarling broke through the rhythmic clopping of hoofs. The horses screamed. A heavy weight slammed into the roof of the carriage, the wood groaning under the pressure of claws. Chapter 3. The Shadow on the Roof. The carriage swayed dangerously as the weight above us shifted. Stanton wasn't waiting for the moon to set. He was hunting already. The refined alpha of the ballroom was gone, replaced by a male driven by a biological obsession he couldn't name. I could smell him through the roof, the scent of lavender cologne completely drowned out by the acrid stench of a wolf in a forced, territorial frenzy. "Stay down," Caspian commanded. His voice wasn't loud, but it had the authority of a mountain. He didn't look worried. If anything, he looked bored, as if an alpha attacking his carriage was a minor inconvenience on a Tuesday. "He's going to tear the roof off," I whispered, my heart hammering against my ribs, though not with fear. It was adrenaline, a wild, reckless heat that matched the man sitting across from me. Caspian reached for the door handle, but before he could turn it, a clawed hand ripped through the leather paneling of the ceiling. Wood splintered, raining on my silk skirts. Stanton's face appeared in the jagged hole, his eyes wide and bloodshot, his teeth bared in a snarl that was more animal than man. He wasn't fully shifted, that would be too messy for his pride, but his ears were pointed and his claws were long, ivory daggers. "Mine!" Stanton roared, the sound echoing in the small space. Caspian didn't even stand up. He simply looked up at Stanton with a look of profound pity. "You rejected her, Stanton. You broke the bond in front of 100 witnesses. You don't get to claim the spoils of a war you surrendered." "I was mistaken." Stanton lunged through the hole, reaching for my arm. I didn't wait for Caspian to defend me. I snatched a heavy silver brandy decanter from the side table and slammed it into Stanton's reaching hand. The silver didn't burn him, this wasn't a fairy tale, but the weight of the crystal crushed his fingers against the jagged wood. Stanton howled in pain, retracting his hand. I stood up, ignoring the way the carriage rocked. "I am not a piece of territory for you to map out, Stanton. Go back to your lace and your Genevieve. You made your choice." Caspian's hand shot out, catching me by the waist and pulling me back into the seat, just as Stanton slammed his weight into the side of the carriage, trying to overturn it. We tipped onto 2 wheels. I felt the world go sideways, the gravity pulling me directly into Caspian's chest. He was solid as stone, his arms wrapping around me with a strength that felt like a fortress. "Enough," Caspian growled. The word wasn't a shout, it was a frequency. It was the sound of a king. The carriage slammed back down onto 4 wheels with a bone-jarring thud. Caspian kicked the door open and stepped out into the muddy street, dragging me behind him in a protective arc. We were on the outskirts of the city, where the gas lights were few and the shadows were long. Stanton was crouched on the roof of the carriage like a gargoyle, his fine tailcoat shredded, his chest heaving. But he wasn't looking at me anymore. He was looking behind us. The sound of several pairs of heavy boots hit the cobblestones. Out of the darkness stepped 3 men, all built like Caspian, massive, silent, and radiating a heat that made the cold mist evaporate around them. They didn't have guns, they didn't have knives, they just stood there, their presence alone turning the street into a predatory cage. "Your jurisdiction ends at the city gates, Alpha Thorn. You are currently standing on the king's property, and the king is very particular about his cargo." Stanton looked at the 3 Lycans, then at Caspian, and finally at me. He looked pathetic. A high society wolf realized he had wandered into a den of lions. But Stanton was desperate, and desperation in an alpha is a poisonous thing. He took a breath to howl, to call his own pack from the shadows. Caspian didn't wait. He moved so fast, I only saw a blur of white linen and dark hair. Chapter 4. The Gray Zone. The air didn't just get colder as the carriage crossed the invisible line of the gray zone. It got heavier. The refined smells of the city, horse manure, coal, and cheap perfume were replaced by the scent of ancient earth, wet pine, and something metallic that made the back of my throat itch. We had been driving for hours in silence. Caspian sat across from me, his shirt still bloodied from where Stanton's claws had grazed him during the brief, violent skirmish at the city gates. He hadn't shifted, he hadn't even broken a sweat. He had simply swatted Stanton aside like an unruly pup and tossed him into the gutter. The image of the great alpha of the North Ridge face down in a puddle was a memory I planned to savor. "You're staring," Caspian said, not opening his eyes. "You're bleeding," I countered. He opened one eye, the dark pupil dilated until only a sliver of iris remained. "It's a scratch. My kind heals faster than yours, Beatrice. By the time we reach the stronghold, there won't even be a scar." "Your kind," I repeated, tasting the words. "You say it like you're a different species." "Biologically, I am." He sat up, the movement fluid and predatory. Standard wolves are social creatures. They need packs, they need hierarchies and ceremonies to feel secure. Lycans, we are solitary by nature. We don't have lunas, we have mates, and once we find them, the world tends to burn down around us. The carriage slowed as we approached a massive iron gate flanked by stone pillars topped with snarling wolf heads. This wasn't a manor, it was a fortress built into the side of a mountain, its dark stone glistening in the moonlight. As the gates creaked open, I saw silhouettes moving along the ramparts, men and women who moved with a grace that made the ballroom dancers look like toddlers. The carriage pulled into a courtyard lit by massive braziers. As I stepped out, the heat hit me like a physical blow. The gray zone wasn't just a territory, it was a living, breathing entity of primal energy. Caspian offered me his arm again, but this time it felt different. In the ballroom, it was a lifeline. Here, in his home, it felt like an invitation to a throne.
"Welcome to the Black Crag," he murmured. We walked through grand halls of black marble and red velvet. Servants, if you could call them that, for they looked more like warriors in fine livery, bowed as we passed. They didn't look at me with pity or curiosity. They looked at me with a reverence that made my skin crawl. "Why are they looking at me like that?" I whispered. "Because," Caspian said, stopping at the base of a grand staircase that wound up into the darkness of the upper floors. "In 30 years, I have never brought a woman here, and they can smell exactly what you are to me." "And what am I?" I challenged, my heart skipping a beat. He stepped closer, his scent, cedar, rain, and raw male, filling my senses until I couldn't think. He didn't touch me, but the heat radiating from his body was so intense I felt my corset grow tight. He leaned down, his lips brushing the shell of my ear. "You are the only person in this world who doesn't smell like fear when I walk into a room, and you are the only one whose scent makes my wolf want to tear this fortress down just to build it back up for you." Before I could respond, the heavy front doors of the hall slammed open. One of Caspian's sentries ran in, his face pale and his breathing ragged. "Sire," the man gasped, dropping to one knee. "The North Ridge pack, they aren't just hunting. Stanton has called for a blood gathering. He's telling the other alphas that you've kidnapped his true mate and that the Lycan King has broken the Treaty of 1812. Caspian's face didn't change, but the braziers in the hall suddenly flared higher, the flames turning a deep, angry orange. He turned his gaze back to me, a dark promise in his eyes. "It seems your former alpha wants a war," Caspian said softly. "Perhaps it's time we showed him what happens when a king actually decides to fight." Chapter 5. The King's Council. The news of the blood gathering hung in the air like the scent of impending rain. Stanton was playing a dangerous game, using the Treaty of 1812, a dusty set of rules meant to keep Lycans in the mountains and wolves in the ballrooms, as a weapon. Caspian didn't roar. He didn't even flinch. He simply reached out and adjusted the lace at my wrist, his fingers lingering on my pulse point. It was thrumming, not with terror, but with a wild, singing energy. "Let him call his gathering," Caspian said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to settle deep in my bones. He led me up the grand staircase, his hand resting firmly on the small of my back. The heat of his palm through my silk gown was a constant, grounding presence. We entered a massive library where the walls were lined with leather-bound tomes and the air smelled of beeswax and old secrets. 5 men and 2 women stood around a heavy oak table. They didn't look like the pampered aristocrats of the North Ridge. These were Lycans. Their presence felt less like a polished mirror and more like a whetted blade. "Beatrice," Caspian announced, and the room went still. "She stays. If Stanton wants a war over a bond he severed with his own mouth, we will give him one that will leave his territory in ashes." A tall woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes that looked like flint stepped forward. She didn't bow, but she dipped her head in a gesture of recognition.
The treaty is clear, Caspian. If the other alphas believe you've taken a mate against her will, they have the right to challenge your sovereignty. The gray zone will be overrun before the week is out. Then we make it clear, I said, stepping out from the shadow of Caspian's side. My voice felt stronger here, in this room of predators, than it ever had in the Silver Oak ballroom.
The silver-haired woman looked at me, a slow, appreciative smile tugging at her lips. She has fire. Most Omegas would be hiding in the linens. I am not an Omega, I replied, the words tasting like iron. I am a woman who is tired of being the prize in a game I didn't ask to play. Caspian's hand tightened slightly on my waist. The heat radiating from him was reaching a fever pitch. He turned me to face him, his eyes searching mine. To stop the gathering, we must prove the claim is invalid, but Stanton will argue the rejection was a moment of madness, a biological lapse. He'll try to invoke the rebinding. The rebinding? I asked, the term sending a chill through me. A primitive ritual, the woman explained. If an alpha can touch his rejected mate before another male claims her, the bond can be forced back into place. It's painful, it's invasive, and it's legal under the old laws. Caspian's jaw set, his gaze turning lethal. He will never touch her again. But the only way to stop the gathering is for Beatrice to stand before the Council of Alphas and choose another. And who would be foolish enough to challenge a king for me? I asked, half joking, though the tension in the room was suffocating. Caspian leaned in, his lips inches from mine. The scent of him, primal and protective, wrapped around me. Not challenge me, Beatrice. Join me. A frantic pounding echoed through the hallway. The doors burst open, and a young sentry stood there, his face streaked with dirt. "Sire, the Northridge forces, they aren't waiting for the council. They've crossed the Black River. They've brought the hounds." Caspian's eyes darkened, the pupils vanishing into a sea of black. The hounds weren't wolves. They were the alpha's personal executioners, beasts bred for the hunt, devoid of reason or mercy. Chapter 6. The Black River. The sound of the hounds was a low, mournful baying that seemed to vibrate through the very stones of the Black Crag. It wasn't the sound of a wolf's howl. It was the sound of a predator designed only for the kill. I followed Caspian through the stone corridors, the silk of my skirts rustling like a warning. He had shed his jacket, his white shirt clinging to the broad muscles of his back as he moved with a terrifying liquid grace. "Stanton is desperate," Caspian muttered, his voice a low growl. "To send the hounds into the gray zone is an act of suicide. He's not trying to win her back, he's trying to destroy what he can't have." We reached the high battlements that overlooked the Black River. Far below, the water churned white and violent, carving a path through the jagged ravine. On the opposite bank, a line of torches flickered through the mist, Stanton's men. But it was the shapes moving between the torches that made my blood run cold. They were larger than any wolf I had ever seen, their bodies low to the ground, moving with a jerky, unnatural rhythm. "How do we stop them?" I asked, my fingers gripping the cold stone of the parapet. "We don't stop them," Caspian said, turning to me. He looked entirely different now. The civilized man from the carriage was gone. His skin seemed to hum with an internal heat, and his scent was so powerful it was nearly intoxicating. An intoxicating mix of wood smoke and pure, unadulterated power. He stepped closer, his hands framing my face. His palms were hot, almost scorching. "Beatrice, listen to me. The hounds track by the scent of the bond. Even though Stanton rejected you, there is a lingering trace, a ghost of his mark. As long as that scent remains, they will never stop coming." "Then how do I get rid of it?" I asked, my heart racing. "I've tried to scrub it off, to ignore it." "You can't scrub it off," he whispered, his thumb grazing my lower lip. "You need a new scent, one that is so dominant, so primal, that the ghost of Stanton is burned out of your system." The baying grew closer. The first of the hounds had reached the river's edge, its massive paws splashing into the icy water.
It was a nightmare of matted fur and yellow eyes, its snout twitching as it locked on to my location. Caspian's gaze was intense, his pupils wide. "I won't force a mark on you, Beatrice, but if you want to live to see the sunrise, you have to choose. Now." The heat between us was a physical force, a biological magnet pulling me toward him. I reached up, my fingers tangling in the dark hair at the nape of his neck, and pulled him down. The kiss wasn't a romance, it was a collision. It tasted of salt and storm. His hands moved to my waist, lifting me until I was pressed against the cold stone of the battlement and the searing heat of his chest. It was an assault on the senses, a deliberate claiming that had nothing to do with magic and everything to do with chemistry. I could feel the pheromones shifting in the air, the heavy, cedar-scented aura of the Lycan King wrapping around me like a cloak. A sudden, sharp yelp echoed from the river below. I pulled back, breathless, and looked down. The lead hound had stopped in the middle of the river. It was shaking, its snout wrinkled in confusion. It sniffed the air, its head tilting as it searched for the scent it had been tracking. But the trail was gone. It looked up at the battlements, its yellow eyes landing on us, and then it whimpered, turning tail and fleeing back towards the north ridge. Caspian let out a low, victorious sound in his throat, but the triumph was short-lived. A single, piercing whistle cut through the night from the opposite shore. Stanton stepped into the light of the torches, holding a long, dark object in his hand. Chapter 7. The Alpha's Gambit. Stanton stood on the muddy bank of the Black River, the orange glow of the torches casting long, flickering shadows behind him. In his hand, he didn't hold a rifle or a blade. That would have been too simple. He held a heavy, ornate silver whistle, an heirloom of the North Ridge, used to command the pack during the great shifts of the past century. He brought it to his lips, but no sound came out, at least not one that human ears could hear. The air around us suddenly curdled. The vibration was so high, so piercing, that it felt like a needle being driven into my brain. I slumped against Caspian, my hands flying to my ears. "He's using the frequency," Caspian hissed, his teeth bared. He looked less affected, but his muscles were corded with tension, his wolf fighting the biological command embedded in the whistle's tone. The frequency was a biological trigger, a vocal command amplified by the silver of the whistle. It was designed to force a pack into submission, to override a shifter's free will and bring them to their knees. For a rejected mate, it was a siren song of forced regret, a biological lie that told my body I needed Stanton to survive. "Get out of my head," I gasped, my knees buckling. The phantom pain of the rejection, which had been silenced by Caspian's kiss, flared back to life like an infected wound. I could feel Stanton's pull, a sickening, greasy tug at my core that tried to drag me back across the river. Caspian scooped me up into his arms, his chest rumbling with a growl that shook my entire frame. He turned and carried me away from the battlements, back into the stone heart of the fortress. "He can't sustain it for long," Caspian muttered, his voice strained, "but he's trying to trigger a regressive shift. He wants to force you into your wolf form so he can hunt you like an animal." He kicked open the doors to his private chambers and set me down on the furs before the fireplace. The room was warm, but I was shivering. My skin felt too tight, my bones aching as the frequency continued to hum in the distance. "I won't let him have me," I whispered, my fingernails digging into the rugs. "I'll die before I go back to that ballroom." Caspian knelt before me, his eyes burning with a dark, protective fire. He grabbed my hands, his heat seeping into my chilled skin. "Then you have to drown him out, Beatrice. You have to find a sound louder than his command." "How?" I cried, as the high-pitched vibration in the air seemed to shatter my thoughts. Caspian leaned in, his forehead resting against mine. "The Lycan roar isn't just a sound, it's a physical weight. I can block the frequency, but only if you let me into the deepest part of your senses. I have to claim the space Stanton is trying to steal." "Do it," I choked out. "Do anything." Caspian sat back on his haunches, his chest expanding as he took a deep, rattling breath. He didn't shift into a wolf. This was something different. His neck thickened, his jaw unhinging slightly, and then he let out a sound that I felt in my teeth before I heard it. It wasn't a howl, it was a rhythmic sub-bass thrum that seemed to swallow the air in the room. The frequency from the whistle vanished, smothered by the sheer volume of the king's presence. The pain in my head receded, replaced by a heavy, pulsing warmth that radiated from Caspian. I felt my body relax, the ache in my bones dissolving. But as the silence returned, I realized the cost. Caspian was gasping for air, his skin flushed and slick with sweat. The effort of countering the Alpha's command had drained him. He slumped forward, his head resting in my lap, his breathing heavy and ragged. The fortress was silent now, save for the crackling of the fire. But the silence didn't last. From the hallway outside, the sound of heavy, rhythmic thumping began. It wasn't boots. It was the sound of something large and wet dragging itself along the floor. Caspian's ears twitched. He tried to push himself up, but his arms shook. "The hounds," he whispered, his voice cracked. "One of them, it got inside before I closed the gate." The door to the chambers groaned as something massive leaned against it from the other side. A low, wet snarl vibrated through the wood.
Chapter 8. The Price of the Throne. The wood of the chamber door didn't just splinter, it groaned like a dying beast under the pressure of the intruder. Caspian was a fallen god at my feet, his skin radiating a feverish heat as his body fought the exhaustion of the counter-roar. The Lycan King had shielded my mind, but in doing so, he had left his own fortress unguarded. I looked from his weakened form to the heavy oak door, and for the first time in my life, I didn't wait for a man to tell me what to do. I scrambled to my feet, my silk skirts tangling around my ankles. I scanned the room. No guns, no silver blades, just the opulent trappings of a man who thought himself invincible. My eyes landed on the heavy iron fire poker resting by the hearth. It wasn't elegant, and it certainly wasn't ladylike, but as a massive, matted paw punched a hole through the lower panel of the door, elegance felt like a luxury I had outgrown. "Beatrice, get back," Caspian rasped, his hand clawing at the rug as he tried to find his footing. His eyes were bloodshot, his pupils still dilated from the effort of the roar. "Stay down, Caspian," I snapped, my voice sounding more like a command than I intended. The door gave way with a sickening crack. The hound didn't burst in, it poured in, a mass of wet fur, protruding bone, and eyes that were nothing but milky cataracts of rage. It was a biological mistake, a wolf stripped of its soul and pumped with alpha-driven aggression. It ignored the scent of the king, its snout twitching as it locked on the lingering phantom trace of Stanton that still clung around me. The beast lunged. It was a blur of gray and black, its jaws snapping inches from my face. I didn't retreat. I swung the iron poker with every ounce of spite I had accumulated since that ballroom rejection. The metal connected with the creature's ribs with a dull thud. It yelped, a sound that was more mechanical than animal, and skidded across the marble floor. It was faster than it looked. Before I could reset my stance, it pivoted, its claws gouging deep furrows into the wood. It sprang again, this time aiming for my throat. I raised my arm to shield myself, expecting the agony of teeth, but a sudden massive weight slammed into the side of the beast. Caspian hadn't stood up. He had launched himself from his knees, his shoulder colliding with the hound's chest. They tumbled into a heavy velvet armchair, splintering the gold-leafed wood. Caspian pinned the creature, his hands now tipped with thick ivory nails, digging into its throat. He wasn't shifting, but his strength was terrifying. The muscles in his back coiled like pythons under his shredded shirt. "Beatrice, the hearth, the salt, on the mantel, throw it into the flames." I didn't ask why. I grabbed the crystal bowl of coarse salt and flung the contents into the roaring flames. The fire didn't just flare, it turned a brilliant, searing white, emitting a scent so sharp it felt like it was cleaning the very air. The hound let out a final rattling shriek and went limp. It didn't die, it simply deflated, the biological command that animated it dissolved by the sudden purification of the atmosphere. Caspian shoved the carcass aside and collapsed against the ruins of the chair. He was shaking, his chest heaving. I dropped the poker and knelt beside him, my hands shaking as I reached for him. "Is it over?" I whispered. He looked at me. A grim, weary smile touched his lips. "The hound is dealt with, but Stanton knows now. He felt the frequency break. He knows I am weakened." He reached out, his hot fingers staining my white lace with the creature's dark, oily blood. "He's not waiting for the council anymore, Beatrice. He's coming to the gates himself, and he's not coming to talk."
Chapter 9. The Ghost of a Bond. The silence after the hound's defeat was more oppressive than the noise of the battle. The white fire in the hearth died down to a low, steady blue, casting an eerie, cold light over the chamber. Caspian was asleep, or perhaps unconscious, his head resting against the remains of the velvet chair. I sat on the floor beside him, watching the rise and fall of his chest, my own body humming with a strange, residual heat. I looked at my hands. The lace of my gloves was ruined, stained with blood and soot. I peeled them off, throwing them into the blue embers. As I did, I noticed something that made my breath hitch. On the inside of my wrist, where Stanton's mark had once been a faint, faded shadow, a new pattern was emerging. It wasn't a bite or a scar, it was a darkening of the skin, a series of swirling, elegant lines that looked like ink beneath the surface. It wasn't magic, it was a biological response to Caspian's roar, a physiological claiming triggered by the intensity of the night. I felt a sudden, sharp pang in my chest, not of pain, but of a deep, echoing hollowness. "It's the recoil," a voice said from the doorway. I jumped, reaching for the poker, but it was only the silver-haired Lycan woman from the council. She stood in the shadows, her eyes fixed on my wrist. "What's the what?" I asked, pulling my sleeve down. "The recoil," she repeated, stepping into the room. "Stanton rejected you, but he didn't realize that the bond is a two-way circuit. When he tried to use that whistle, he sent a surge of energy through a connection that no longer has a ground. He's hurting, Beatrice, probably more than you are right now." "Good," I said, the word coming out sharper than I expected. "I hope it burns." "It does more than burn. It drives a male mad. It's why he's at the gates. He thinks if he can just touch you, the pain will stop." She looked at Caspian, then back at me. "But you've allowed the king to overwrite him. That mark on your wrist, that's your body choosing a new frequency. If Stanton sees that, he won't just be angry, he'll be broken." "I don't care about his feelings," I said, standing up. I felt a sudden, fierce protectiveness for the man sleeping in the chair. "I care about what happens when he tries to break down those gates." "He won't have to," she said grimly. "The other alphas have arrived. They saw the hounds. They saw the king's roar flare. They believe Caspian has gone rogue, that he's using you as a catalyst to start a war. They're demanding a trial by presence." "What is that?" "A social execution. You and Caspian must stand in the neutral circle at the center of the courtyard. The alphas will use their combined presence to try and force you to submit. If you bow, Caspian loses his crown, and you are returned to Stanton. If we stand, then you prove the Lycan King has found his equal, and the Northridge's seat on the council forever." A horn sounded in the distance, a long, mournful note that echoed off the mountain walls. It was the call of the council. I looked at Caspian. His eyes were open now, watching me with a quiet, devastating intensity. He had heard everything. He reached out, his fingers brushing the new mark on my wrist. "Do you want to stand, Beatrice?" he asked, his voice a mere whisper. "I can send you out the back way. My people will hide you in the high caves. You don't have to be a queen." I looked at the mark, then at him. I thought of the ballroom, the whispers, and the way Stanton had looked at me like I was a mistake. I thought of the iron poker and the white fire. "I'm done hiding," I said, offering him my hand. "Let's go show them what a mistake looks like." Chapter 10. The Trial by Presence. The courtyard of the Black Crag was a sea of black wool and cold silver. 6 alphas stood in a semicircle, their faces illuminated by the towering braziers. They looked like statues of ice, their presence so heavy it felt like the air itself had turned to lead. At the center of the semicircle stood Stanton. He had cleaned himself up, but his eyes were sunken and his hands were trembling in his white gloves. Caspian and I walked out onto the cobblestones. He was dressed in a fresh black coat, his movements stiff but steady. I wore a gown of deep crimson silk, a color that felt like a challenge in this world of muted grays and blacks. As we entered the center of the courtyard, the temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees. The trial wasn't a fight, it was a psychological siege. The 6 alphas began to project their dominance, a silent, crushing weight of collective will. It was like standing at the base of a dam that was about to burst. My lungs felt constricted, my knees wanting to buckle under the sheer frequency of their combined power. Beatrice, one of the older alphas, spoke, his voice echoing in the stone space. You are a member of the North Ridge. You have been taken from your territory during a sacred mate selection. Do you claim you are here by choice? I opened my mouth to speak, but the pressure increased. It was Stanton. He was staring at me, his gaze a desperate, clawing thing. Come back, his presence whispered into my mind, a greasy, unwanted intimacy. It was a mistake. I can fix it. Just bow. I felt a bead of sweat roll down my temple. Beside me, Caspian was a pillar of heat. He wasn't fighting back yet. He was letting me find my own footing. He knew that if he carried me through this, I would never truly be free. I am not a member of the North Ridge. Alpha Stanton rejected me. He severed the bond in front of 100 witnesses. By the laws of the 1812 treaty, I am a free agent of the gray zone.
A lie, Stanton shouted, breaking the etiquette of the trial. Look at her wrist. He has marked her against her will. The alphas stepped closer, their collective presence intensifying. The weight was unbearable now. It felt like a physical hand pressing on my shoulders, forcing me toward the stones. I saw Stanton smirk, a flash of his old arrogance returning. He thought I was weak. He thought because I was an Omega, I would eventually break and seek the comfort of his shadow. But he forgot one thing. I had already broken, and when you break, you can be forged into something much harder. I reached out and grabbed Caspian's hand, lacing my fingers with his. I didn't look at Stanton, I looked at the Lycan King. I drew on his heat, his stability, and the roar that still echoed in my blood. I felt the mark on my wrist begin to pulse with a rhythmic, steady heat. The pressure didn't lift, I simply rose above it. I stood up straight, my head held high, my crimson skirts swirling around my feet. The collective will of the alphas hit me and shattered like glass against stone. I am not a prize to be reclaimed, and I am not a victim of the king. I am his mate, by choice and by blood, and if you want to challenge that, you'll have to do it through me. The silence that followed was absolute. Stanton looked as though I had struck him across the face. But the trial wasn't over. One of the alphas, a man with eyes as cold as the mountain peaks, stepped forward. A mate by choice is one thing, but a queen must prove she can lead the hunt. If you are truly his equal, Beatrice, then you will have no trouble facing the mirror of the moon. He gestured to a large, polished silver basin filled with dark water that sat at the edge of the courtyard.
Chapter 11. The Mirror of the Moon. The silver basin sat on a pedestal of jagged basalt, its surface as dark and unyielding as obsidian. In the 19th century shifter courts, the mirror was the ultimate arbiter of truth. It didn't use magic, it used the chemistry of the shift. A wolf's reflection in the water revealed their true biological rank, their fitness to lead, their hidden sicknesses, and the strength of their loyalties. For an Omega, the water usually remained dull, reflecting only a soft, subservient haze. I felt Stanton's eyes burning into the side of my face. He was desperate for the water to show a void, proof that I was a broken thing wandering in the king's shadow. Beside me, Caspian's hand tightened on mine. His heat was a low, protective hum, but he didn't pull me back. He knew this was the final wall I had to climb alone. The rules are ancient, the cold-eyed alpha said, his breath visible in the freezing night air. Look into the water, Beatrice. Let the pack see the wolf you carry. If you are a queen, the water will boil. If you are a stray, the water will stay still, and you will return to the North Ridge to face your alpha's judgment. I stepped toward the basin. The crimson silk of my skirts hissed against the cobblestones, the only sound in the suffocating silence. I reached the edge and looked down. At first, I saw nothing but my own face, pale, determined, and framed by the dark curls that have escaped my pins during the struggle in the carriage. Then, the water began to vibrate. It wasn't a ripple from the wind, it was a rhythmic pulse originating from the center of the bowl. I felt the mark on my wrist begin to throb in time with the water. The biological recoil from Stanton's whistle and the predatory claim from Caspian's roar were fighting a war inside my blood, and the mirror was caught in the crossfire. The water began to darken, turning from a deep navy to a thick, oily black. "She's hiding it," Stanton hissed, his voice cracking with nerves. "Silence, Stanton," Caspian growled. The sound was so deep, it made the silver basin ring like a bell.
Suddenly, the water didn't just boil, it erupted. A geyser of freezing dark liquid shot upward, splashing the alphas in the front row. The surface of the mirror became a swirling vortex, and within the depths, a shape began to form. It wasn't the small, lithe wolf of an omega, it was something massive, with shoulders as broad as a mountain and eyes that held the terrifying, steady light of a Lycan. The alphas recoiled, their polished boots clicking frantically on the stone. "Impossible," the cold-eyed alpha whispered, his composure finally shattering. "She was born in the North Ridge. Her lineage is recorded. She should be a standard wolf." "Lineage is a theory," Caspian said, stepping up behind me. He placed his hands on my shoulders, his heat grounding me as the mirror's energy threatened to pull me under. "My blood didn't just claim her, it woke her up. You aren't looking at an omega who was raised in status. You're looking at a Lycan queen who was buried in the wrong pack." I looked up from the water, my vision clearing. I felt taller, my senses sharpened to a lethal edge. I could smell the terror coming off the council, the scent of wet fur and sour adrenaline. But more than that, I could smell Stanton. He wasn't just afraid, he was deteriorating. The rejection he had dealt me was now eating him from the inside out, a biological rot that happens when an alpha discards a mate that was actually his superior. He stumbled forward, his hand reaching for the silver basin, his eyes wide and vacant. "It's a trick," he mumbled, his voice a pathetic whimper. "She's mine. The bond, it's still there. I can feel it." He lunged for the water, intending to shatter the reflection, but as his fingers touched the silver, a violent crack echoed through the courtyard. The basin didn't just break, it detonated into 1,000 silver shards. Chapter 12. The Rot of the North. The explosion of the mirror sent a shockwave of silence through the black crag. Silver shards lay scattered across the cobblestones like fallen stars, and the dark water stained the ground, smelling of ancient earth and ozone. Stanton remained on his knees, staring at the empty pedestal. His white gloves were shredded, his fingers bleeding from where the silver had bitten into his skin. "The trial is over," Caspian's voice rang out, cold and final. He didn't look at the council, he looked only at me, his hand resting on the hilt of his presence. "The mirror has spoken. Beatrice is no longer subject to the North Ridge. She is a sovereign of the gray zone." The alphas began to murmur, their unity broken. They looked at Stanton with a growing disgust. In the shifter world, strength was the only currency, and Stanton was currently bankrupt. "Wait," Stanton croaked. He stood up slowly, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. His cravat was gone, his shirt open to reveal a chest that was covered in dark, bruising marks, the physical manifestation of the rejection recoil. "I still have the right of the rebinding. The treaty says that if the alpha can prove the mate still reacts to his touch, the choice is void." "You wouldn't dare." The silver-haired Lycan woman stepped forward, her eyes flashing with a predatory light. "I have the right," Stanton screamed, his voice breaking. He turned to the council, his eyes wild. "Look at her. She's still wearing my scent. She's still reacting to me." It was a lie, but it was a legal loophole. The trial by presence had proven my status, but the trial by touch was a visceral, biological test that the council couldn't ignore without risking a civil war between the packs. Caspian stepped in front of me, his body vibrating with a suppressed roar. "If you lay a finger on her, Stanton, I will rip your heart out before you can blink." "Then you admit the touch would prove me right," Stanton sneered, a desperate, manic grin stretching his face. "If she's truly yours, King, then my touch should mean nothing. What are you afraid of?" The pressure in the courtyard shifted again. This wasn't the heavy weight of the council's presence. It was the sharp, biting tension of a trap. If Caspian refused, he looked like a tyrant hiding a victim. If he agreed, he risked Stanton's desperate toxic biology triggering a regressive reaction at me. "I'm not afraid," I said, stepping out from behind Caspian. My voice was like ice, startling even myself with its coldness. I felt a strange, detached calm. Stanton was a ghost of a man, a fading echo of a life I no longer recognized. "Beatrice, no," Caspian whispered, his hand catching my arm. "He's unstable. His biology is in a state of collapse. His touch could be—" "It will be nothing," I said, looking Caspian in the eyes. "Because I don't belong to his world anymore. Let him try." The council formed a new circle, smaller and more intimate. I stood in the center, my arms at my sides. Stanton approached me, his scent a nauseating mix of lavender and decay. He stopped a foot away, his breathing ragged. Up close, I could see the fine tremors in his jaw. "Beatrice," he whispered, his voice dripping with a false, sickening tenderness. "Remember the first time we ran through the woods. Remember the heat. It's still there. You just need to feel it." He reached out his hand, his fingers trembling as they moved toward my bare shoulder. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I watched his hand like a scientist watching a specimen. The moment his skin touched mine, a shock of cold, not heat, ripped through the courtyard. Chapter 13. The Queen's Verdict. The expected spark of the mate bond didn't happen. There was no rush of heat, no softening of my features, no instinctive bow of my head. Instead, Stanton's touch felt like a piece of dry ice pressed against my skin, a numbing, lifeless cold that had no place in my body. Stanton's eyes went wide. He pressed his palm harder against my shoulder, his fingers digging into my skin as if he could force his way back into my soul. "No," he hissed, his face inches from mine. "Feel it. Feel the bond. I am your alpha. I am your mate." I looked him directly in the eye, and for the first time I didn't see a powerful leader or a cruel master. I saw a man who had built his entire identity on a throne of glass, and the glass was finally shattering. "I feel nothing, Stanton," I said, my voice carrying to the very back of the courtyard. "I don't even feel pity. You are a stranger who smells like a dying season." The biological recoil hit Stanton then, and it hit him with the force of a tidal wave. Because I didn't react, because there was no circuit for his energy to flow into, the rejection he had initiated days ago finally completed its cycle. It turned back on its source. Stanton let out a strangled cry, his hand flying back from my shoulder as if I had burned him. He collapsed to the stones, clutching his chest. His skin, already bruised, began to turn a dark, mottled purple. This was the final stage of rejection psychosis, the body's total failure to sustain itself without the mate it had discarded. The Council of Alphas looked on in horror. They had never seen an alpha break so completely. Stanton rolled onto his back, his breathing coming in wet, ragged gasps. He looked up at the sky, his eyes searching for a moon goddess that didn't exist in our world of blood and bone.
"Take him away," the cold-eyed alpha commanded, his voice devoid of emotion. "He is no longer an alpha. He is a lone wolf. The North Ridge is declared vacant." 2 sentries stepped forward and dragged Stanton out of the courtyard. He didn't fight them. He didn't even speak. He was a hollow shell, his pride having been his only substance. Caspian was at my side in an instant, his arms wrapping around me, his heat flooding into the cold spaces Stanton's touch had left behind. I leaned into him, my strength finally beginning to waver as the adrenaline of the night ebbed away. "You did it," Caspian whispered into my hair. "You broke him without a single claw." "I broke himself," I replied, closing my eyes. "I just stopped holding the pieces together." We stood there for a moment, the Lycan King and his queen, as the council began to disperse. But as the last of the alphas reached the gates, a low, rhythmic thudding began to vibrate through the earth. It wasn't the sound of a hunt or a gathering. It was the sound of a massive, coordinated movement. Hundreds of boots, hundreds of horses, and the heavy, metallic scent of a different kind of power. Caspian stiffened, his head snapping toward the mountains. His eyes, which had softened for a moment, turned back into black pits of predatory focus. "The treaty," he said, his voice dropping into a deadly rumble. "The alphas didn't just come for a trial. They brought the southern packs. They aren't here for Stanton, Beatrice. They're here for the gray zone." The gates of the Black Crag groaned as they were slammed shut from the outside. We weren't just in a fortress, we were in a cage, and the most dangerous wolves in the hemisphere were currently locking the door.
Chapter 14. The Iron Lockdown. The sound of the gates slamming shut was a finality that echoed through the stone marrow of the Black Crag. It wasn't the sound of protection, it was the sound of a trap. The southern packs, the aristocratic high society wolves who had long feared the Lycan bloodline, hadn't come to witness a trial. They'd come to harvest a revolution. Caspian's hand dropped from my shoulder to the small of my back, his grip firm and proprietary. The heat radiating from him was no longer a comfort, it was a weapon, a dense wall of pheromones that pushed back against the encroaching scent of thousands of hostile wolves. They didn't just bring the alphas, they brought the enforcers, the ones who believe that any wolf who doesn't bow to the Southern Council is a beast to be put down. I looked up at the ramparts. The silver-haired Lycan woman, who I now knew as Hera, was already barking orders to the sentries. There were no guns, no cannons, just the raw physical power of shifters who understood that the true high ground was measured in lung capacity and bite force. Stanton was the bait. A cold realization settled in my chest. The council knew he was unstable. They knew he would cause a skein, and they used the scandal of my rejection to justify an occupation of the gray zone. Caspian turned me to face him. The gas lights in the courtyard flickered as the wind picked up, casting frantic shadows across the black marble. They think they can starve us out. They think because we are solitary, we lack the coordination to hold a siege. They are about to learn that a Lycan's territory is not defined by stone walls, but by the reach of his claws. He looked at Hera and signaled with a sharp tilt of his head. "Hera, move the non-combatants to the lower vaults and bring the scent breakers. If they want to hunt us by smell, we'll give them a maze they'll never escape." "And what about me?" I asked, my crimson silk skirts catching the wind like a flag of war. "I'm not a non-combatant, Caspian, and I'm certainly not going to sit in a vault while they play at being judges." Caspian's eyes darkened, his pupils expanding until the iris was a mere sliver of gold. He didn't tell me to stay back. He didn't try to protect me from the truth. He reached out and tucked a loose curl behind my ear, his fingers hot enough to sting. "You are the center of their legal claim, Beatrice. As long as you are by my side, their occupation is an act of war, not a rescue mission. You aren't going to the vaults. You're coming to the war room." As we turned toward the inner keep, a massive thud shook the earth. It wasn't the gates. It was something heavier. I looked back and saw a group of Southern enforcers, men in pristine white tailcoats and silver-tipped canes, stepping out of the mist. They didn't look like warriors, they looked like bankers, but as they approached the base of our walls, they began to move in a synchronized, eerie rhythm. They weren't shifting, they were projecting. A wave of collective dominance hit the fortress walls, so powerful that the stones themselves seemed to groan. It was a mental assault designed to crush the will of any lower-ranking wolf inside. My knees wobbled, the sheer volume of their arrogance pressing down on my skull. Caspian let out a sharp, jagged bark, a sound designed to disrupt their frequency. Focus on me, Beatrice. Their power is a lie built on numbers. Focus on the heat. I gripped his arm, my nails digging through his fine wool sleeve. But as I fought to stay upright, I realized the enforcers weren't alone. Standing behind them, draped in a cloak of white fur that looked suspiciously like a wolf's hide, was Lady Genevieve. She wasn't cowering anymore. She held a heavy black leather book, the registry of the great families, and she was pointing directly at me. By the law of the Southern Council, the female Beatrice is declared biologically compromised. She is to be seized for purification, and the king is to be stripped of his title for the crime of scent pollution. The enforcers stepped forward as one, their canes striking the ground in a rhythmic, deafening beat.
Chapter 15. The Scent Breakers. The interior of the war room was a sensory overload. Braziers burned with dried sage and cedar, the smoke thick and heavy to mask our internal movements from the noses outside. Maps of the mountain passes were spread across a mahogany table, held down by heavy silver paperweights shaped like wolves. Caspian stood at the head of the table, his shirt discarded, revealing the intricate dark patterns of his own lichen marks. They mirrored the ones on my wrist, pulsing with a low, rhythmic heat that I could feel even from across the room. "They are using the purification law," Harris spat, throwing a bundle of aromatic herbs into a brazier. "It's a medieval tactic dressed in 19th century suits. They claim Beatrice's biology has been corrupted by lichen pheromones, giving them the right to reset her system. It's a death sentence for her mind, Caspian." "They won't get near her," Caspian growled, his gaze fixed on the map. "The enforcers are projecting a dominance field to keep my sentry suppressed. They think they can walk through the gates once our wolves are too paralyzed to fight back." "Then we change the air," I said, stepping up to the table. I looked at the scent breakers, vials of concentrated primal oils that the lichens use to mask their trails. "You said the enforcers project a field based on their collective arrogance, but that field relies on them sensing our submission. What happens if they can't sense us at all?" Caspian looked at me, a slow, predatory smirk spreading across his face. "You want to flood the courtyard with the dead scent?" "I want to flood it with my scent," I corrected him. I felt a reckless, hot confidence surging through my veins. The mirror showed that I am a lichen queen. My biology isn't compromised, it's amplified. If I can project my own presence through those vents, I can break their frequency. "It would take a massive toll on you, Beatrice," Hera warned. "To project that far, you have to open every sensory gate in your body. You'll be vulnerable to every smell, every sound, every stray thought for miles." "I've spent my life being told to be quiet and small. I think it's time the Southern Council heard what a compromised woman actually sounds like." Caspian walked around the table and stopped inches from me. He didn't try to talk me out of it. He reached out and cupped the back of my neck, his thumb grazing the sensitive skin beneath my ear. "If you do this, I go with you. My presence will be the anchor. We'll project together, the king and the queen. We'll show them that the gray zone doesn't have a hierarchy. It has a heartbeat." We moved to the center of the room, where a large brass ventilation grate sat in the floor, connected to the fortress's ancient air cycling system. I knelt on the cold stone, and Caspian knelt behind me, his chest pressed against my back, his heat flooding into me, creating a closed circuit of energy. I closed my eyes and let go of the ballroom etiquette I had spent years perfecting. I stopped fighting the smells of the fortress, the blood, the sage, the ancient stone. I let it all in. I reached for the mark on my wrist and pulled the heat upward, through my arms, into my chest. Beside me, I felt Caspian's roar, not a sound but a vibration, start in his lungs. I joined him. I didn't use my voice, I used my presence. I pushed the image of the crimson silk, the broken mirror, and the cold rejection of Stanton out through the vents. I sent out the scent of a woman who had walked through fire and found she liked the heat. Outside, the rhythmic thumping of the enforcers' canes faltered. The collective dominance field, which had felt like a lead blanket, suddenly began to fray. She's fighting back. I heard a muffled voice shout from the courtyard. But as my presence expanded, I felt something I didn't expect. A dark, sharp needle of a scent pierced through the haze. It was coming from inside the fortress. Someone was standing in the shadows of the war room, watching us, and they smelled like lavender and betrayal.
Chapter 16. The Breach of Trust. The projection was working, but the cost was exactly as Hera had warned. My senses were raw, every nerve ending exposed to the atmosphere like an open wound. The intruder's scent, lavender and something cold, something chemical, was like a scream in my mind. I couldn't break the connection with Caspian, or the enforcers outside would regain their footing, but I could feel the figure moving closer, their footsteps silent to a human, but deafening to a Lycan queen. Caspian, I gasped, the words struggling to leave my lungs as I continued to push my presence through the vents. He felt it too, his muscles tightened, his grip on my waist becoming a vice. But he knew if we stopped now, the southern packs would be over the walls in minutes. We were trapped in our own defense. "Don't move," a voice whispered from the darkness behind us. It was a voice I knew, refined, melodic, and utterly devoid of mercy. It was one of the alphas from the council, the one with the cold eyes who had presided over the trial. Hera moved to intercept him, but the alpha was faster. He didn't shift, he simply used a burst of predatory speed to sidestep her, his hand reaching for the silver decanter on the table. He didn't use it as a weapon, he poured a clear, viscous liquid from a small vial into the central brazier. The sage and cedar smoke turned a sickly neon green. The Southern Council doesn't just rely on purification by law, the alpha sneered, his face illuminated by the poisonous flare. We have spent decades developing the null scent, a chemical cocktail designed to paralyze Lycan nerves. It's a shame, really. You would have made a fascinating study. The effect was instantaneous. The connection between Caspian and me snapped like a frozen wire. My presence recoiled back into my body with the force of a physical blow, leaving me gasping on the floor. Caspian slumped over, his eyes rolling back as his nervous system was flooded with the toxin. The enforcers outside let out a collective roar of triumph as our defense vanished. The gates of the Black Crag groaned under a fresh assault, the sound of splintering wood echoing through the halls. You betrayed your own kind," I managed to choke out, my vision blurring as the green smoke filled my lungs. "Kind?" The alpha laughed, stepping over Caspian's prone body. He knelt beside me, his cold eyes searching mine. "I am a wolf of the new era, Beatrice. We don't need kings and biological matches. We need order. We need a world where omegas stay in the ballroom and Lycans stay in cages." He reached out to grab my hair, to drag me away before the southern soldiers arrived. But he forgot that I wasn't just a Lycan queen. I was a woman who had spent years navigating the toxic politics of the North Ridge. I knew what it felt like to breathe in poison and keep smiling. I reached for the iron fire poker I had tucked into the folds of my crimson gown earlier that night. It was hot from being near the braziers, the metal glowing a faint, dull red. "I talk too much," I whispered. I didn't swing for his head, I swung for the brazier. I knocked the heavy brass bowl over, spilling the poisoned embers directly onto the alpha's polished leather boots. He screamed as the null scent, in its concentrated solid form, ignited against his skin. The distraction was enough. I crawled toward Caspian, my hands shaking as I tried to shake him awake. "Caspian, wake up! They're in the courtyard!" The doors to the war room burst open. It wasn't the Southern enforcers, it was Stanton. He looked like a corpse brought back to life, his skin gray, his eyes sunken, and his fine clothes hanging off his skeletal frame. But he held a heavy iron key in his hand, and his gaze was fixed on me with a terrifying, blank intensity. Chapter 17. The Key to the Cage. Stanton didn't move like a man. He moved like a marionette with frayed strings. The rejection psychosis had hollowed him out, leaving only the obsessive core of his biological drive. He didn't seem to notice the green smoke or the screaming alpha at his feet. He only saw me. "I found it, Beatrice," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. He held up the iron key. "The key to the lower sluice gates, the back way into the mountain. I can get you out. I can take you back to the ridge. We can start over." "Stanton, look at yourself," I said, finally pushing myself up to my knees. My lungs burned, but the fresh air coming from the doorway was beginning to clear the green haze. "I'm not dying, I'm ascending." He lunged toward me, but his movements were slow, clumsy. He tripped over Caspian's legs and fell to the floor, the iron key skidding across the stone toward the ventilation grate. My heart stopped. That key was the only way to open the emergency floodgates, a last resort defense that would wash the southern enforcers out of the courtyard and into the ravine. If it fell through the grate, it was gone forever. I dived for the key, my fingers brushing the cold iron just as Stanton's hand clamped around my ankle. His grip was surprisingly strong, the strength of a dying animal. "You're not leaving me again," he howled, his eyes bulging. "If I can't have the Luna, then no one gets the Queen." Beside us, Caspian let out a low, agonizing groan. The toxin was wearing off, his Lycan biology fighting back. His eyes snapped open, and he saw Stanton pinning me. A sound came from his throat that wasn't a roar, it was a promise of extinction. But Caspian was too far away. Stanton pulled me back, his other hand reaching for my throat. I could smell the rot on him, the scent of a soul that had turned to ash. "The key, Beatrice," Hera shouted from across the room, where she was finally recovering from the Alpha's initial assault. "The sluice gates, it's the only way." I looked at the key, then at the grate, then at Stanton. I didn't have the strength to fight him off and reach the key. I had to choose. I kicked Stanton in the chest with my heavy, silk-covered heel, giving myself an inch of space. I didn't reach for the key. I reached for the decanter of water on the table and threw it at Stanton's face. The cold water shocked him for a split second, his grip loosening. I lunged for the key, grabbed it, and rolled toward the ventilation grate. But as I did, the floor beneath us suddenly groaned. The Southern enforcers hadn't just been thumping their canes for intimidation, they had been using the frequency to find a fault line in the fortress's foundations. A massive crack ripped through the stone of the war room, splitting the floor in two. I found myself on one side of the chasm, holding the key. Stanton and the poisoned Alpha were on the other, and in the middle, teetering on the edge of the growing hole, was Caspian. The sound of the southern gates finally giving way echoed through the fortress. The southern packs were inside. "Beatrice!" Caspian shouted, reaching across the gap. "The gates! Forget me! Open the sluice!" I looked down into the dark abyss of the crack, then at the door where the first of the white-coated enforcers were appearing. "I don't leave my king," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos. I threw the key not to the sluice gate, but to Hera. "Hera, the gates, now!" I turned and leapt across the chasm, my crimson skirts flying behind me. I didn't know if I would make the jump, or if Caspian would have the strength to catch me. I only knew that I was done being a prize to be won. I was the one who decided where the pieces fell.
Chapter 18, The Sovereign Dawn. My fingers brushed against Caspian's palm, a searing, desperate heat as the floor groaned its final surrender. He hauled me upward, the strength of his Lycan blood defying the toxin, as he pinned me against his chest. Behind us, the chasm swallowed the table and the screaming, poisoned Alpha, leaving only the sound of crumbling stone. On the far side of the breach, Stanton stood frozen, the iron key no longer in his reach, his eyes empty as he watched the woman he had rejected choose a king in the face of death. "Hera, now!" Caspian's voice was a thunderclap that shook the remaining rafters. Across the room, Hera caught the iron key mid-air and slammed it into the bypass lock at the base of the wall. There was no magical flash, only the heavy mechanical thud of a mountain's heart being released. Deep within the black crag, the sluice gates groaned open. A muffled roar echoed from the courtyard below. I scrambled to the edge of the breach with Caspian, looking through the high windows. The Southern enforcers, in their pristine white tailcoats and silver-tipped canes, had just breached the inner courtyard. They were a sea of arrogant certainty, moving towards the keep like a slow-moving tide. Then the mountain spoke. Thousands of gallons of icy, subterranean river water erupted from the vents at the base of the fortress. It wasn't a gentle flood. It was a high-pressure wall of liquid fury. The enforcers were swept off their feet, their dominion fields shattered as they were tossed like rag dolls into the churning ravine. The purification they had planned for me was delivered to them instead, a cold, indifferent washing of the gray zone. Stanton watched the destruction from across the gap, his knees buckling. The sight of his allies being washed away by the very territory he sought to reclaim was the final blow to his fractured psyche. He looked at me one last time, not with rage, but with a terrifying, hollow clarity. He finally understood that he hadn't just lost a mate, he had lost the future. Without a word, he turned and walked back into the smoke-filled shadows of the hallway, a ghost retreating into a grave of his own making.
Silence gradually reclaimed the war room, broken only by the hiss of the dying braziers and the distant rush of the river. The null scent had dissipated, replaced by the sharp, clean smell of wet stone and pine. Caspian turned to me, his face streaked with soot and blood, but his eyes were bright, more golden than they had ever been. He didn't bow, he didn't offer a crown, he simply reached out and traced the dark, swirling mark on my wrist, which was now glowing with a steady, permanent warmth. "The council will regroup," he said softly, his voice a low vibration that made the air feel safe again. "They will call this a tragedy, an accident of geography, but they will never step foot in the gray zone again. Not while you stand here." "I didn't do it for the council," I said, leaning into him, my crimson gown ruined, but my spirit forged into something Stanton could never have touched. "And what does that woman want now?" Caspian asked, his hands sliding to my waist, pulling me into the epicenter of his heat. "I want a world where the scent of fear is replaced by the scent of choice." We walked out onto the high battlements as the first light of dawn touched the mountain peaks. Below, the southern packs were retreating, their torches extinguished by the flood. The gray zone was quiet, primal, and finally ours. Caspian stood beside me, his presence a dark, unyielding anchor in a world that had tried to drift me away. I looked at the horizon, the lace of my sleeves fluttering in the morning breeze. I was no longer the rejected omega, the social outcast, or the compromised specimen. I was the heartbeat of the mountains. I was the Lycan Queen. And as Caspian leaned down to claim my lips in the cold, honest light of the new day, I knew that the story of my life wasn't about the man who let me go. It was about the woman who decided to stay.